Claire adjusted the baby monitor volume as she sank into the living room couch, the soft murmur of her toddler's lullabies filling the quiet. The late afternoon sun stretched across the hardwood floor, casting golden rectangles under the coffee table. Everything looked peaceful, exactly as a home should feel after 5 years of stable marriage and suburban routine. But lately, Claire had noticed something she couldn't explain, a slow shift in the air, like furniture subtly moving on its own. And it all seemed to start with Helen's visits. Her mother-in-law had always been polite, a bit formal, never overly warm, but consistently dependable. Since David's father had passed 3 years ago, Helen had remained strong, perhaps too strong, insisting on managing everything herself, never asking for help. At first, Claire admired that independence. But now, Helen was dropping by nearly every other day. Sometimes with excuses, a forgotten sweater, a new recipe to try, a bag of groceries she accidentally overbought, but more often without any real reason. And always, Claire noticed, at times when David wasn't home. It was Tuesday afternoon when Helen appeared again, just before dinner prep. Claire opened the door to find her standing with a tray of lemon bars, her lips stretched in a polite smile. "I thought I'd drop these off," Helen said breezily, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Claire forced a smile. "That's sweet, but you didn't have to bake." "I didn't. Your father did," Helen replied, setting the tray down. "I just delivered." Claire's heart skipped. "My father? You two spoke?" Helen blinked as though realizing the slip, then smiled again, softer this time. "Oh, just a quick call. He wanted to share a recipe." Claire stared at her. It didn't make sense. Her father wasn't the lemon bar type. He'd been a mechanic most of his life, and after her mother died 2 years ago, he barely touched a stove unless he had to. Claire had tried encouraging him to join cooking classes or social clubs, but he'd always declined. Now, suddenly, he was baking desserts? That night at dinner, Claire asked David casually, "Did your mom ever mention she talks to my dad?" David shrugged. "Not that I remember." "Why?" "She brought lemon bars today. Said Dad made them." He looked up from his plate. "Your dad baked?" "That's what I said." David frowned, but didn't press it. And Claire didn't push either. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, the pattern became clearer. Helen started calling more often, sometimes to check in on Claire, sometimes just to ask if she needed help with errands. On 2 occasions, Claire had caught her mother-in-law arriving just minutes after her father had left. She began to wonder if it was just coincidence, but the odds felt wrong. There were subtle clues, too. Once, Helen accidentally referred to Richard by his first name in a way that sounded familiar. Another time, Claire found a men's scarf in the back seat of Helen's car when Helen had asked her to fetch a grocery bag. It looked like the same scarf Claire had bought her father last Christmas. The tipping point came during a Sunday lunch at Claire and David's home. Helen had come early to help cook, and halfway through peeling potatoes, she received a call. She excused herself, stepping out into the backyard with her phone pressed tightly to her ear. Through the kitchen window, Claire watched her animated expressions, the way she turned her body away from the house, laughed, too freely, too easily. When Helen came back inside, her cheeks were flushed. "Everything okay?" Claire asked, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Just a friend," Helen said. "We're planning a book club meeting." "A book club?" "Yes. Richard recommended a novel. We might discuss it." Claire didn't say a word. She simply nodded and kept stirring the sauce. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay next to David, listening to his steady breathing, wondering if she was inventing things. Maybe she was just being paranoid. Both Helen and Richard were widowed. It wasn't impossible for 2 lonely people to form a connection. But then, why the secrecy? She decided to talk to her father the next day. Claire called in the morning and invited herself over. "I'll bring coffee," she said before he could object. 10 o'clock? He hesitated, then agreed. When she arrived, Richard looked surprised, even flustered. He'd shaved, something he rarely bothered with anymore, and there was a faint whiff of cologne in the air. The living room was tidier than usual, and the dining table had been freshly wiped. "You expecting someone?" she asked lightly. "No," he said too quickly. Claire set the coffee cups down and sat opposite him. "Dad, can I ask you something without you getting weird?" He laughed nervously. That depends. Sounds like a trap. Have you been talking to Helen? Richard froze for half a second before recovering. Helen? David's mom? Claire nodded. He scratched his jaw. Well, sure. Here and there. We bumped into each other at the hardware store a while back, then had coffee. She's nice. Claire didn't say anything. I mean, he added, we're just two adults who've lost our spouses. Nothing dramatic. But you didn't tell me. Richard sighed. What was I supposed to say? That I ran into my daughter's mother-in-law and we had coffee? I didn't think it was newsworthy. Claire stared at her father's face. It was the same face that raised her after her mother's sudden illness. The same man who taught her to ride a bike and grill burgers every 4th of July. She believed he didn't mean harm, but something about the situation didn't sit right. Later that afternoon, Claire sat in her car in the grocery store parking lot, just thinking. The puzzle pieces were all there. Too many coincidences, too much evasiveness. What hurt wasn't that they were seeing each other, if that was even the case. It was that they'd kept it from her. As if she'd somehow disapprove or not be able to handle it. It felt like a violation of trust, a quiet betrayal wrapped in politeness. That night, Claire made up her mind. She wouldn't accuse. She wouldn't confront. She would wait. Watch. And if the truth was what she suspected, she would deal with it then. But part of her already knew the truth. Somewhere deep down, beneath the carefully managed routines and the cordial smiles, she felt it like a hairline fracture in a mirror, small but irreversible. And the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was that everything familiar was starting to feel unfamiliar. Her home, her family, her foundation. The visits weren't just unusual anymore. They were a warning. Claire woke up earlier than usual on Thursday. A quiet anxiety had followed her since the conversation with her father earlier that week, the kind that didn't shout, but whispered steadily in the background of her every thought. She moved through her morning routine distractedly, brushed her teeth, packed her son's lunch, and kissed David goodbye as he left for work, but her focus kept drifting back to the sense that something had slipped past her defenses, like a shadow moving just outside her field of vision. After dropping her son off at preschool, Claire sat in her car outside the coffee shop for a long while, watching the early traffic roll past. She hadn't planned on going anywhere else, but something pulled at her, a quiet need to know. Her father's schedule was usually predictable. Mornings at home, afternoons sometimes at the garage he still tinkered in, even though he was retired. Thursdays, though, were supposed to be his nothing days. Her fingers drummed against the steering wheel. She could call, sure, but he'd give her a voice smoothed over with casual phrases. No, what she wanted was clarity. And the truth wasn't going to offer itself on the phone. Without overthinking it, she turned the key and pulled out, heading toward her father's house. She told herself it was a simple check-in, a coffee drop-off like she had done countless times before. But she didn't stop for coffee. Instead, she drove with her stomach tightening as the trees lining her old childhood street came into view. His modest home sat quietly at the end of the cul-de-sac, tucked behind a neatly trimmed hedge. She pulled up slowly and saw it immediately, Helen's car, parked crookedly in the driveway. Her familiar beige sedan was unmistakable. Claire sat frozen in the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The air conditioning hummed softly, but her breath was shallow. She hadn't called ahead, hadn't knocked. No warning. She hadn't expected this, not really. Maybe she'd suspected, but seeing it changed everything. She turned the ignition off and stepped out of the car quietly. Her footsteps felt too loud on the pavement. The front curtains were half closed, letting a beam of morning light spill through the window. She approached the door slowly, unsure of whether she would knock or turn back. But then she heard laughter. Two voices, Helen's and her father's. Not just casual laughter either, something intimate. Familiar. The kind of laughter people share when they're past politeness. Her heart thudded as she stepped to the side, onto the path leading around to the back porch. A soft breeze ruffled the branches of the lemon tree she and her dad had planted when she was 16. Everything felt surreal, the memory of her younger self at odds with the scene unfolding inside. She peeked through the kitchen window at the back. What she saw hit her like a cold slap to the face. There was Helen, standing at the kitchen island, holding a coffee mug, barefoot, her hair down, looser than Claire had ever seen it. Richard stood next to her, holding her waist, pressing a kiss to her cheek. It wasn't obscene. It wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakably affectionate. Familiar. Intimate. Claire stepped back abruptly, her heel crunching a twig beneath her. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Inside, the conversation continued undisturbed. They hadn't heard her, but she didn't linger. She walked briskly back to her car, her mind spinning. By the time she pulled out of the neighborhood, her hands were trembling on the steering wheel. She couldn't even cry yet, just stared forward, the scenes behind her eyes playing on repeat. She didn't tell David that night. How could she? She still didn't know how to process it herself. She cooked dinner in silence, responding to questions with nods and half-smiles. David didn't press. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. That night, after their son was asleep and the dishes were washed, Claire sat outside on the porch, wrapped in a sweater, sipping wine she didn't even taste. The air was cooling, summer beginning to fade, and with it, the last strands of stability she thought her life was wrapped in. She replayed every strange moment over the last 2 months. The unannounced visits, the overlapping appearances, the casual deflections. It wasn't just suspicion now, it was certainty. Her father and mother-in-law were in a relationship, a secret one, and that secrecy made it feel so much worse. The next morning, Claire called her friend Lena and asked if she could talk. They met at a quiet cafe downtown, where Claire recounted the entire experience, her voice low but urgent. Lena listened carefully, her brow furrowed. Wait, so your dad and your husband's mom are dating? Claire winced at the word. Yes, or something like it. Jesus. And nobody told you? Claire shook her head. I saw them. And my dad's. They looked comfortable, like this had been going on for a while. Lena leaned back in her chair, tried to process it. I mean, technically it's not illegal. They're not blood relatives. But emotionally, yeah, it's a lot. Claire swallowed hard. It feels like betrayal. From both of them. They've been lying to us. Sneaking around. Hiding this. Why? Lena hesitated. Because they knew you and David might take it badly. That doesn't make it right, but maybe they just didn't know how to handle it. Claire nodded slowly. She wasn't angry at the relationship itself. Two lonely people finding comfort in each other. That wasn't a crime. But keeping it a secret from the people closest to them, that was something else entirely. She debated telling David all day. By dinner, she still hadn't. The timing never felt right. And maybe, selfishly, she wasn't ready for what his reaction might be. But that night, as she folded laundry on the bed and David scrolled through his phone, he asked casually, Hey, did my mom say anything to you? I called her this morning, and she sounded off. Like distracted. Claire paused, her hands on a towel. Her mouth opened, then closed. This was the moment. She could lie, or she could step fully into the storm. She was at Dad's yesterday, Claire said finally. David looked up. Okay, she wasn't just visiting. They're seeing each other. I saw them. Together. Intimately. David stared at her, the silence in the room expanding. What? Claire nodded. I went over without calling. Her car was there. I looked through the window. They were close. He sat on the bed slowly, like the weight of her words pushed him down. How long? I don't know. But it's not new. David ran a hand through his hair. Why the hell didn't they say anything? That's what I've been asking myself. They didn't speak for several minutes. The dryer hummed softly in the background, and outside, a dog barked once before going quiet. David finally exhaled, long and slow. I don't know what to do with this. Neither do I. The days that followed were tense. David called his mother, asking to meet. Claire reached out to her father, demanding answers. What followed would fracture the family in ways they hadn't imagined. But for now, Claire stood in the middle of her life, knowing that nothing was the same anymore. And it had all started with one visit. One window. One moment she couldn't unsee. Claire sat on the edge of her bed, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, the morning light slanting through the blinds behind her. She hadn't slept. The hours had bled together into a haze of questions that looped endlessly in her mind. Her stomach churned with a cocktail of anxiety and betrayal. And no matter how she tried to rationalize it, She couldn't escape the feeling that her life had split down the middle. David hadn't said much after she told him. He had remained quiet, distant, as though the weight of it all hadn't settled yet. But this morning, he was up early. She heard him downstairs, pacing. By the time Claire came into the kitchen, he had already showered and changed. His phone was in his hand. He didn't look up. "I'm going to talk to her," he said flatly. "Today." Claire nodded. "Do you want me to come with you?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I need to do this alone." David drove to his mother's house mid-morning, a small brick bungalow just 20 minutes away. Helen greeted him at the door with her usual composed smile, but the moment she saw his face, the smile faltered. "Come in," she said quietly. He stepped into the living room, arms folded across his chest. She gestured toward the sofa, but he remained standing. "How long?" he asked without preamble. Helen blinked. "David, how long have you been seeing Claire's father?" There was no use pretending. She sat down slowly, clasping her hands together in her lap. "Almost a year." David exhaled sharply, as if the confirmation knocked the wind out of him. "A year. A whole year. And you didn't say a word." Helen's voice was calm but strained. "We didn't know how to tell you. At first it was just two people talking. It didn't feel serious. Then it became something more, and the longer we waited, the harder it got." David shook his head, pacing now. "You don't get to use that excuse. We're your children. You don't just get to hide something like this. You were in my wife's childhood home, laughing with her father while we sat at dinners, pretending everything was normal." "I wasn't pretending," Helen said softly. "I was trying to figure out how to protect you both. I know this is strange, but I didn't want to hurt you." "You hurt us anyway," David said, his voice quieter now, but no less sharp. Helen's eyes glistened. "I lost your father. Richard lost his wife. We found comfort. And then, yes, we fell in love. But we never meant to deceive you. We just didn't want to make things worse." David looked at her then, really looked. His mother, who had always seemed composed, immovable, suddenly looked older. Not frail, but tired. Human. Vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to see her in years. "I don't know how to process this," he said at last. "I know," she whispered, "but please try. We weren't trying to replace anyone. We were just trying to live again." Meanwhile, Claire was across town, preparing to confront her own half of the equation. She called her father that morning and asked to come by. Her voice had been curt, and he knew better than to argue. When she arrived, Richard opened the door wearing the same mechanic's shirt he'd worn for years, but she noticed his expression was taut, his usual ease gone. She walked past him into the living room without waiting. "I saw you with her," she said, turning to face him. "I didn't mean to, but I did. So please, don't insult me by pretending." Richard shut the door slowly, then nodded. "I figured you might." "How long?" she asked, echoing David's question hours earlier. 11 months. Claire sat down hard on the arm of the chair, stunned again even though she'd known. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Why keep it a secret?" "I didn't know how," he admitted. "It started small. Just coffee. Conversation. Then we started meeting more often. And then it just became real. But the longer it went on, the more afraid I became to tell you. I didn't want to ruin things between us." Claire stared at him. "You didn't ruin things by dating her. You ruined things by hiding it from me." He looked ashamed. "I know, and I hate that I made you feel betrayed. That wasn't my intention. I just—" She paused, trying to gather her thoughts. "You and her. Do you realize how complicated that is for David and me? You're not just two strangers who met at a grocery store. You're part of the same family web. This changes everything." "I know," he repeated, "but we're not trying to make things harder. We're trying to hold on to what happiness we can." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "You should have trusted us." Later that evening, David returned home and sat with Claire in the living room. The TV was on, but neither of them was watching. Their son was asleep upstairs, the baby monitor humming softly. "Well?" Claire asked without looking at him. She didn't deny it. Said it's been going on nearly a year. Said she loves him. Claire nodded. He said the same. They were silent for a while. "Are you angry?" she asked finally. David shook his head. "Not angry. Just hurt. It's like the ground shifted and I didn't notice until now." "I keep thinking about holidays," Claire murmured. About what happens if they get married. What does that make us? Step-siblings by marriage? Does that change anything? How do we explain that to our son? David gave a sad half-laugh. I don't know. It's messy. Do you think they did it knowing it would hurt us? No, he said. I think they did it hoping it wouldn't. And that was the mistake. Claire leaned her head against his shoulder. Do we talk to them together? I think we have to, he said. If they want to move forward, they owe us a conversation. All of us. A few days later, the four of them met at a quiet restaurant outside town, somewhere neutral. The air was heavy with unspoken tension as they sat at the table, menus untouched. Claire looked between them. Let's not pretend this is normal. It's not, but we need to understand where this is going. Richard nodded. We're not asking for permission, but we are asking for understanding. We love each other. Helen added, we wanted to tell you. We were just afraid. David's voice was calm. We're not asking you to end it. But if we're going to be one family now, then we need honesty. From this point forward, Claire nodded. No more secrets. That's our condition. Both Helen and Richard agreed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. And that, finally, was a place to begin. Later that night, back at home, Claire lay in bed next to David. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The house was quiet, and though nothing had been resolved completely, a strange calm had settled over them. Do you think we'll ever get used to it? She asked softly. David turned toward her. I think we'll have to. Weeks passed, and slowly, the sharp edges of shock dulled into a strange, uncertain normal. Claire found herself moving through life differently, as if a filter had been removed, and she could see everything more clearly, sometimes painfully so. The morning still began the same way. Making breakfast, packing her son's lunch, loading the dishwasher, but a part she hadn't noticed before, was now constantly measuring trust, recalibrating the meaning of family. After the confrontation dinner, things didn't magically resolve. No hugs, no emotional reconciliations over wine. But the silence was broken, and that made all the difference. Helen and Richard had begun being open about their relationship. Not boastful or excessive, but no longer hiding it in glances or missed phone calls. That alone brought a tentative kind of peace. One Saturday morning, Claire stood in her kitchen, sipping coffee when David came in holding his phone. My mom wants to have dinner at their place, he said, not looking up from the screen. Both of us. With them. Claire raised an eyebrow. You mean with your mom and my dad? He finally looked at her and shrugged. They said it's important. She stared into her coffee for a moment, then nodded. Okay. The dinner was scheduled for the following Friday. All week Claire was tense, unsure of how to prepare for something that had no precedent. It wasn't just a dinner. It was an emotional referendum. Would she sit there judging? Would she lash out? Or would she, somehow, begin letting go? When the night arrived, Claire wore a simple navy dress and spent far too long on her hair, not for vanity, but for control. Like if she could manage how she looked, she might manage how she felt. David was quiet during the drive. Their son was at Claire's friend's house for a sleepover. They needed space to navigate this as adults, without the cushion or distraction of parenting. Richard's house looked the same from the outside, but when they walked in, Claire noticed subtle changes. The lighting was softer, a new table runner, fresh flowers, Helen's touches. It felt strange, like two lives she'd always known were now grafted together in real time, in real space. Helen greeted them at the door with a smile that looked practiced but not dishonest. Come in. Dinner's almost ready. Richard came in from the kitchen, carrying a tray of appetizers. You two hungry? Claire nodded, unsure what to say. She followed them into the dining room, where the table was neatly set, candles flickering gently. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic hung in the air, warm and inviting. For a moment, Claire felt disarmed. The meal started quietly. Conversation was surface level, work, the weather, her son's latest fascination with dinosaurs. Claire watched her father and Helen interact. Gentle gestures, shared glances. They looked like a couple, and not in a performative way, but in the subtle rhythm of two people genuinely at ease with each other. It made her heart ache, unexpectedly, not from resentment, but from recognition. Midway through the meal, Richard put down his fork and cleared his throat. "We want to talk to you both about something." Claire's stomach tightened. Helen continued. "We're planning to move in together. Not right away, but in the next few months." David nodded slowly. "Okay." And Richard added, "We're also considering getting married. Eventually." Claire blinked, staring at her plate. 1,000 thoughts collided in her head, but surprisingly, none of them screamed. She wasn't shocked. Deep down, she'd known this might come, and yet hearing it aloud planted the truth in her chest like an anchor. "Are you hoping we'll be happy for you?" she asked, not bitterly but honestly. Helen's voice was gentle. "We're hoping you'll accept it. Support isn't something we can demand, but we do want your blessing." Claire set her fork down and looked at them both. "You lied to us for almost a year. Not out of malice, I get that, but you still built something behind our backs and then expected us to celebrate it." "We didn't expect celebration," Richard said. "Just honesty moving forward." Claire nodded. "Then let's be honest. This still feels weird. I look at you two, and part of me still flinches because it's not what I pictured when I thought about family. But—" She stopped and looked at David. He spoke carefully. "But it's not wrong. Just uncomfortable. And discomfort isn't a reason to punish people we love." Claire smiled faintly. "Exactly." Helen exhaled. "Thank you." After dinner, they all moved to the living room. The air felt lighter now, the initial tension replaced with something closer to understanding. They talked for over an hour, about the future, about how holidays would work, about boundaries. Claire and David made it clear that their son's routines wouldn't be disrupted, that trust would have to be re-earned over time, and that this family, whatever it looked like, had to be rooted in communication. That night, driving home, Claire looked out the window, the streetlights casting flickers of gold across her face. "You think it'll ever feel normal?" she asked softly. David glanced at her. "Maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it just has to feel honest." Claire smiled. "That's good." Weeks turned into months. Helen moved in with Richard. A small ceremony was planned for the spring. Nothing big, just a courthouse and a dinner with family. Claire and David decided not to attend the ceremony, not out of spite, but because they felt it was better to give them space to not force emotion that wasn't fully formed yet. Instead, they hosted a dinner for the newlyweds a week later, bringing their son and a gift, a framed photo of the boy with both grandparents. It was a gesture, but a meaningful one. Slowly, the roles shifted. Claire found herself speaking with Helen more openly. Richard and David began working on fixing up an old motorcycle together. Claire's son started calling Helen and Richard grandma and grandpa with ease, unaware of the complicated story behind those titles. And somehow, that innocence helped heal things faster than any long conversation ever could. Claire still had moments, brief flashes of discomfort, of grief for the version of her family she thought she had. But those moments passed more quickly now, replaced by something stronger. Acceptance. The kind that doesn't come from surrendering, but from choosing. One evening, Claire stood in her backyard watching the sunset, a glass of wine in her hand. David came out, joining her in the fading light. They didn't speak for a while. Finally, Claire said, "You know what I've realized?" "What?" "That life doesn't owe us consistency. It gives us people, and then it changes them, changes us, and the trick is to figure out whether we still want to walk beside them when the dust settles." David smiled. "And do you?" Claire nodded. "Yes, I do." And with that, the chapter closed, not with thunder, not with finality, but with a quiet kind of peace. A family remade, not in the image of what once was, but in the reality of what had come. Messy, tangled, unexpected, but still held together by choice, by forgiveness, by love.